Hello, everyone, and welcome to Modernizing PeopleSoft IAM, looking beyond the obvious options. We'll be joined by Gregg Browinski and Kim Johnson with our from our friends at BioKey. My name is Scott Labrie. I'm the head of marketing here at Appsian, and I'd like to thank you all for participating in today's PeopleSoft Innovation Summit. Before we get started, I just have a couple housekeeping notes for you, one of which is everyone is muted. The session is being recorded, and we'll be sure to post the recordings on the official PSFTSummit YouTube channel. I would encourage you to go subscribe to that if you haven't already. The session today will be 60 minutes in length, and we'll have a Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put those in the questions section of the control panel. And with that, I will go ahead and turn things over to Kim to begin today's presentation. Kim?
Excellent. Thanks so much, Scott. And thanks for having us joining the PeopleSoft Innovation Summit. Very excited to be here. So as Scott mentioned, this is all about modernizing PeopleSoft identity and access management. We're going to look beyond the obvious options as well as at some of those obvious options. And today, just a quick introduction. So I'm joined by Gregg Browinski. We're each going to do a quick introduction, and of course, in great style, we always give a fun fact. So I'm VP of Product Marketing. Been in identity access management and cybersecurity for over 10 years now. I've been at BioKey since last year, but also with PortalGuard, which was acquired by BioKey last year. Actually, one of the first jobs in my career. So definitely passionate about cybersecurity, all things identity access management. And fun fact is I have become a very avid golfer and very excited about my golf game, but have also realized just how cruel of a sport it can be. So if anyone can sympathize out there, I'm sure you can. So Gregg, I will turn over to you, intro and fun fact.
Yeah, thanks. I'm still licking my wounds from the last few times I went out, so don't worry, Kim, you're in good company. Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Gregg Browinski. I am a principal software developer here at BioKey. I just hit 20 years between BioKey and the prior company. So I've been involved with PortalGuard for all 11 or 12 years of its existence. My fun fact is that picture of that, I'm wearing that exact same shirt right now. No. No, actually, I'm an old school gamer, been doing it for a long time, and I had a reckoning, my comeuppance. I've got two boys, and as everybody knows with COVID, you spend a lot of time indoors, and so I have finally been lapped by them both. They're 13 and 10, and so now both of them regularly beat me in things like Mario Kart and Super Smash Brothers. So it's yeah, it's humbling. It's humbling, but if they're anything like me, they'll keep doing it for a while. So that's my fun fact.
They're going to carry on the legacy, Gregg. They're going to carry on the legacy. That's the idea. All right. And so just a quick, always have to get this in there, quick about who we are. BioKey, we have over 27 years of experience in IAM. We are definitely IAM experts and over about 1,000 customers, most of which have been using our solutions for well over 5 years or more. We have identity and access management solutions that covered the gamut of multi-factor authentication, single sign-on, self-source password reset, which you'll hear about today. But really at the core of our business, we have an expertise in biometric identity and authentication solutions. Our primary platform is PortalGuard Identity as a Service, or IDaaS, and really has key benefits of being a single unified platform, lots of flexible options when it comes to IAM. We're one of the only providers offering biometric expertise and true biometric MFA, which we'll talk about a little bit. Also hybrid environment support, which means all your cloud apps, but as well as your on-prem and desktop login. Also offer a lot of solutions for customer IAM or customer-facing solutions like self-registration, account management, and multi-factor authentication for those use cases. And finally, very affordable. We're usually at about 50% cost of the competition, so easy to budget, and costs don't come unexpectedly, unlike other solutions out there. All right, enough of the pitch. Always like to get that out of the way and get right into the meat of the content. So no good cybersecurity presentation would start out without talking about, obviously, the threats. The actual cybersecurity threats we've seen increasing, especially with COVID impacts, have just taken off. And PeopleSoft is no different. If anything, when looking at PeopleSoft products and looking at what it does for your business, it really is one of those critical applications. And critical because of not only the data that you're storing, it's private and now even being regulated, so but also the different types of people that are accessing PeopleSoft and trying to look and access that data. So anywhere from employees to customers, students, and more. And so it really creates that perfect cybersecurity kind of storm, right? It comes with that inherent cyber risk due to the data that it's storing. And then obviously has a lot of complex layers and hierarchies in terms of the access and what you do or don't want people to be able to gain access to. When looking at some of the stats out there, about 30% of you are worried about a security breach in terms of at least general ERP systems, and that's remained the same. Actually, I was pretty fascinated by that even taking a system such as PeopleSoft to the cloud, which I know has been quite a significant trend, especially again with COVID, that stat remains the same. So 30% and upwards are still worried about that security breach. When we look at specific cybersecurity attacks, and according to the 2020 Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, 67% of them are coming from credential theft, social engineering attacks, and errors such as internal errors or other things that maybe, we tend to be the worst culprits of this, that are really allowing unauthorized access. Greg, you had some great stats on some of the specifics that are listed here and what you're seeing. So expand on that a little bit. What attacks are you digging into and finding as well?
Well, sure. I mean, everybody's longtime favorite, phishing. I mean, I don't know how many times I've been the heir to an unclaimed fortune. It just, my bloodline, I guess, is very, very prevalent. So that's been on everyone's radar for a long time. So, with training and other things, that's definitely become, less of a threat. But so things like ransomware, that's on everybody's mind right now. I mean, this is what keeps me up at night in general. I mean, there's unsophisticated attacks, like script kiddies basically trying to get in, but some of these other sponsored attackers they're just way too sophisticated. And so there's so much money being made. I don't know, I think it was last year I saw a report said about $500 million roughly were paid out, in publicly known, ransomware attacks. So as long as people are paying, there are going to continue to be more attacks. So I think that's only going to increase. And so, you absolutely need like backups of your backups for ransomware. It's just horrifying, how cryptography is basically being used against, legitimate, enterprises and businesses. So.
Right.
Some of the other ones specific to, PeopleSoft, for example, like ghost workers. So, paying people who don't actually exist. I mean, talk about fraud. I mean, that's just, and who knows who's doing that. Some of the smaller ones like time and attendance fraud, whether it is related to, punching the clock or if it's, even related to attendance in class. And then my favorite though is the insider threats, especially because that guy in the lower left has the smallest necktie I've ever seen. But that aside, that one is probably the most pernicious because it's somebody it's an employee. It's somebody that especially, with admins, like even going back to the Twitter hack from last July, that may have been an example of an employee, basically handing over access and saying, here you go, have at it. For the number of accounts that were compromised simultaneously, when they, like Obama and I don't know, everybody under the sun basically said, hey, go, donate Bitcoin, and it was a fraudulent account. So, that's pretty scary. And that whole concept of like account handover is something that you can't take your eye off of. That's why we all have to think about things like privileged access management and auditing and layers of, threat defense, to help combat that, because it is, unfortunately, the bigger a company is, the more likely that you're going to have somebody with those, with that small necktie approach. So, yeah, that's, in general, I think, yeah, those are the big ones that we're obviously everybody's still seeing, but I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, and we've seen, I know that education, right? There's a lot of education folks out there, Phishing attacks on students has become one of the hotter topics too. And so going after users that might be accessing systems such as the PeopleSoft or others that aren't as savvy or aren't as aware of these concerns and threats that maybe somebody internal to an organization would be. And so that's happened time and time again in terms of the sophistication of the phishing attacks, but also the targets of the phishing attacks. They're getting a lot craftier, to say the least.
Yeah, and anytime they can get a toehold, that's the problem. Kind of any fissure or small crack that they can get in and then chain exploits together is going to just lead to bad things.
Right, and we'll cover a little bit later, right? So that ghost, user, so to speak. I would definitely put the question out there to the audience. Do you really know it is Joe, for example, who's accessing? Do you really know it's that person that is accessing the system and should have access and is authorized to do so? Obviously, we'll talk about that in a little bit as to ways to make sure you do. But oftentimes we take some of these things for granted that, oh yeah, we know they're authorized to access when maybe it's just their phone. So I think that there's a lot there in terms of that sharing of credentials, ghosting. One quick anecdote I'll share is we had an organization who thought that their employee was in California working for a long time, great, employee. Turns out once they turned on contextual authentication, again, we'll talk about that, he was in Utah and he had outsourced his job 3 times over. So there's definitely some of these threats. People are probably one of the greatest causes, but just a prolific amount out there in terms of what's impacting systems. So going forward too, as you know, I think this is one of the other most common subjects when you start thinking about the IAM space and security is the change that we've had, and really can't get away when we were looking at the content we're bringing today. We can't get away from talking about remote work and how that amplifies attacks. And when I went out there, I was surprised, right, in terms of all the conversations. I know here at BioKey, we're excited once we can get back together and work together in person. But it looks right now, latest statistic out there is about 2/3 of CFOs, right, are permanently shifting employees to remote work. So that is a long-term impact and one that we really have to get around. The other point that it brings in is that it's really creating a challenge because now you can't secure that access. And one of the things that people did as soon as we all went into shutdown last year is organizations that were cloud first were pretty well off. Other organizations very quickly stood up infrastructure, and some of you on the line may be exactly in that camp. However, what happened is there's a lot of singular solutions that are now stood up and don't necessarily integrate very well. We've seen that on the IAM side with something like deploying a multi-factor authentication, and it doesn't work well with your VPN access. So there's a lot there in terms of the complexity of the environment. Yes, where the person is actually gaining access, but even the infrastructure that's been set up to support that access and secure it. You can see here 71% of you are still very concerned about that remote access being the cause of a data breach. And 42% are saying we just don't know how to even prevent these cyber attacks. And interestingly enough, some of the things that I was thinking, okay, this will be helpful, such as VDI or virtual desktop infrastructure, is a great way to compartmentalize access, but actually it struggles when you start getting remote. The user experience and the performance of it actually degrades when you're outside of the office. Also VPNs, right? So a lot of us are now accessing systems such as the PeopleSoft through a VPN. However, we know out there that a lot of VPN technology has patching vulnerabilities. They're not patched, they're not secure, and hackers aren't, immune to this data. They're out there, they understand that. And so VPNs have become amazing attack surfaces for hackers to really go after. And so these are things like they steal credentials. Also, a misconfigured client is enough to really open up the avenue and the door for an attack to happen. And this was all, exacerbated and expanded with the adoption and increase in cloud usage. And Greg, you were going to talk a little bit about the experience side of things. So I'll turn it over to you for this one.
Yep. Thanks. Yeah. So everything, I mean, even what we do in our product, it's become a commodity. All right. So identity providers, single sign-on, there's a lot. There's a lot of them. And so the things that stick out now are the experiences. That's what people are going to remember. That's what's going to give either that, the negative or a positive impression is, what their interaction was. And so, as you mentioned, everybody's remote, mobile, virtual, and that's not going to change. That's not going to change anytime soon. I mean, it is amazing that, companies are saying, well, geez, I don't need to lease this office space. Well, guess what? My lease is up and they're not going to renew it. So yeah, everybody is going to continue to be remote for a long time, even after everyone's vaccinated and things are under control. And it was interesting that you let me know this, Kim, so this concept, this term of an experience economy, it was coined over 20 years ago, but it's never more relevant than today. And so in this case, experience is the product. And so customers or end users, they're not as influenced by messaging or how long a vendor's been around. If a vendor solution doesn't work, there are enough options out there where, even our customers will say, well, you know what, let's look somewhere else. So what matters is the user's interaction, and how it feels. So creating those positive interactions is really, a key driver for us. It's one of the things we've always talked about. And, the joke, even Kim, your first go around with us 10 years ago, it was about balancing security, and we called it usability at that time. Now the terms have changed a little bit. So balancing security and convenience is really important to making sure customers or end users feel, at ease, they feel secure, and eliminating redundant logins where we can is also part of that. Yeah, so there's definitely a lot that goes into that, and it's from end to end. It's, especially now because the boundaries of, the environment are now pushed out. It's not an end user sitting in an office on a protected network. It's now them at home. It's now them remote, and so it's completely changed.
Yeah, and I think we see time and time again where you have an amazing application like a PeopleSoft, right? Let's say you expose it to maybe a student or a customer or something like that. The application's amazing, the content's there, everything else, and it's that front door, it's that access point that breaks the experience, and it's one of the first things they typically have to do. I know probably everybody has had the moment when that login screen pops up and you're like, just sigh, right? Like, oh, great, I got to do this again.
Not again.
Yeah, it happens to me all the time. And so I think that's really, we're so tuned to being convenient, on demand. You think about an Uber type experience, we expect that whether we're an employee, we expect it whether we're a customer. And so it's so important that you don't think about the authentication and the security last, that you realize that it's actually one of the very first steps in their use.
And yeah, all those stopgaps that may have been put into place initially, like you said, last year when everything went down, now it's for the people that just put those in place just to get through, it's definitely time to make sure that those are being fully evaluated.
Exactly. So in terms of looking at this, and the question is, how do you then secure this access, right? You have remote, you have VPNs aren't the greatest, you have different complications, you're trying to provide a positive experience. How do you make sure the people that are gaining access to PeopleSoft and the sensitive data it stores are who they say they are? And so what we talk about is you have to have a good foundation and go up from there. However, we can tell you there's about 250 plus identity and access management solutions on the market today. And I don't need to tell anybody, if you try to go out there and figure out what works and what will support you, it can get very complicated very quickly. And so it's all about really looking at your IAM strategy, making sure you have one as a first step. I talk to a lot of customers, like, what's your IAM strategy? And they're like, we're winging it, And so it's good to make sure that you have an IAM strategy. And that's what we're here today to talk about. We wanted to give you some of the obvious things, obvious approaches that help cover the basics, but also going beyond, right? To modernize that IAM really is going to take additional steps to go beyond those obvious choices. So let's dive into a few of those. We picked out really the core crux of what an identity and access management solution and approach and strategy should include. And of course, that starts with one of our favorites, at least one of my favorites, is multi-factor authentication, or MFA, right? We love our acronyms, got to get those in there. And so multi-factor authentication really has become the standards, right? The basics for what you have to have in place today. I remember when I started in 2009, federal regulations for financial institutions came out and said you had to have multi-factor. So they all put in a username, password, and a knowledge-based question, right? Something that, what's your first make of your first car, or make of your first car? And so just to clarify, that's not multi-factor. So multi-factor authentication, I think most of you may know this out there, is a combination of something you have, something you know, or something you are. It can't be two of the same thing. So knowing your password and knowing the answer to a question is not multi-factor. And so it's really important to understand what multi-factor is, and understand that it really is a must-have for a sensitive application like PeopleSoft. And honestly, it's become pretty much the standard practice for most of your applications. You do have to look at the sensitivity of the data of the application, but best practice right now is that MFA really is that foundational, obvious choice, is that you need multi-factor authentication. So Greg, let's have you talk through kind of the diagram you have here, and then I know you're going to take us beyond some of those obvious choices. Greg, are you still there?
Yes, I was. I was talking on mute. Can you hear me now? Okay, great. Man, I just dropped a great one too, and that's I don't even remember what I said. No, anyway. So yes, thank you, Kim. So yeah, in general, most web-based multi-factor utilizes an SSO protocol underlying it. And so this could be SAML, this could be something like OAuth, and so in this quick diagram here, so the end users in the upper left, they try to access PeopleSoft, and in this case, an unauthorized or anonymous access, they try to hit the app, and so they are redirected by an arbiter. And so that little thing in front is not, for those of you familiar with Halo 2 on the Xbox, it's not that alien character that you could play. I may be showing my age there, but so it's simply a device or an agent that gates access to the app. And so a lot of apps support single sign-on natively, and in that case, there's no need for that component. But with PeopleSoft, that there is a need for that. So the redirection occurs, and so it pushes the user down to something like PortalGuard, an identity provider, and the IDP is what's responsible for authenticating the user, and that can be however they're configured. Could be single factor, could be multi-factor, could be against different directories, that name and password that's being used, and even now with things like FIDO2 hardware tokens, maybe they're using the passwordless mode, which is something that's coming out in PortalGuard 6.5. But so regardless of how the authentication occurs, whatever is sufficient is done, and it's just between the end user and the identity provider. Once that's complete, then the SSO protocol, again, something like SAML, is what sends a response back through the user's browser, and that's that the nice curvy line there with the arrow. It sends a SAML token or SAML response back to that gatekeeper, if you will, and then the gatekeeper is what's responsible for verifying that token, validating it, make sure it's legitimate. It comes from an identity provider that's trusted and all that kind of stuff. And usually it's digital signatures that are used as that security linchpin, under the covers. But so, I mean, that's, pretty much straightforward. Again, that's SAML. There are other protocols, but so, that's, most of us hopefully are, comfortable with that, in this day and age. And let me go back. Oh, a little lag. There we go. So now let's start talking a little bit about some of the beyond the obvious approaches. So there are a lot of ways to enforce that second factor, right? And so some of the very common ones, I just mentioned FIDO2, so, hardware tokens, phone-based, whether it's mobile apps, things of that nature. But in reality, and everybody who has done anything with MFA knows this, is that there is no silver bullet single method that works for all users in an organization. There's always outliers. There's always these usage gotchas, and a lot of it also kind of comes down to the experience too. So, for example, hardware tokens. You can forget it at home. Oh wait, you're already at home. Well, you can lose it in the in the couch. Who knows? It can break. Like so, for example, the FIDO Alliance, that they recommend purchasing multiple tokens per user. Well, of course they do. They're hardware vendors. They want to sell more. Some of the other things that are very commonly accepted but don't necessarily need to be the de facto is like phones. So for example, you could have a phone, you could have a dead battery, you maybe have no service where you are. And so those are all things that can hamper the use of that. A key thing to keep in mind too is, for example, related to phones, is in California, you have to be careful about potential liability for requiring end users or employees to use personal phones for business purposes. So this can lead to actually having to reimburse employees for a portion or all of their cell phone bill. If you say, hey, you know what, you have to install this app and you have to use this app to do second factor, to get into our organization for whatever purpose, then there is a statute in California that they can basically, the employees can sue and you can end up having to pay them. So that's right now. There are other states like Illinois, Massachusetts, New York, Iowa. They already have similar laws, and they might expand them to be similar to the California law. It's kind of usually seen as like the high watermark for a lot of things. Think about even car emissions. California was one of the first ones, but they're the biggest one. They're a whole economy on their own. So those are things to be careful of and be aware of. So some of the non-obvious things are, for example, wouldn't it be great if you can have admins determine which authentication types are allowable for each type of user, right? So maybe it's, if it's a higher ed, you've got students, you got faculty, you got staff, you got IT, you got admins. Maybe each of those silos of people have different authentication types that make sense for them. And it's, you can enable a whole bunch of different ones as the admin. And then the end user is able to enroll the ones that they prefer. And then they can also choose their own default, right? So that, again, relates right back to that user experience where you're not forcing them, you're not trying to pigeonhole them into specific things that are going to hamper that experience. They're giving them control is one of the best ways to kind of ease that disruption that multi-factor really does introduce into an environment, right? So flexibility is absolutely key, in that case.
Yeah, I was going to say too, oh, sorry, Greg. I was going to say the stat that I read that was probably the most interesting was about 50% of customer facing or customers can't use phone-based. So if you think about the type of people that are trying to access your system, trying to get in, they may not be able to have access to those types of devices. And then the last point I'll make on that is we've had plenty of customers where phone type MFA is not allowed at all because they had, again, that insider threat, the tiny necktie, of taking pictures on their phones of sensitive data and then selling it. So there's been plenty of use cases. One of the most common ones like call centers, but it's very, it's not a one size fits all, Greg, as you mentioned. I think that's a key point. So
yeah, the work from home introduces so many additional considerations.
For sure.
The another non-obvious thing is to implement something like contextual authentication. And so PortalGuard has had this for years, going back to actually 2012. And so now it's sometimes referred to as adaptive authentication. So there are numerous attributes, that you can look at that an IDP, for example, like PortalGuard can look at in the request and the account that's being used and determine like the overall risk for that authentication. So it could be the network that it's on. It could be geolocation. It could be whether that browser device has been seen before, by that using that account. It can come down to recent access, whether it's last successful logins or recently failed attempts. Maybe it's even the groups that the user is a member of. Maybe it's a privileged account that's being used. And then, of course, what data or resource is being accessed. And so being able to take all that and determine the risk and then factor that into the authentication, it's actually twofold. It's interesting because it doesn't mean, oh, I'm always going to, the result of these evaluations is always going to result in a prompt, an additional prompt. It can actually help streamline the access, and so that way, and that is possible. I know it's crazy, but so, sometimes you could say, yeah, we've already seen this device, or, this follows the usage patterns for this user, and, being able to allow them in without, let's say, requiring a second factor. Again, that goes back to the experience of it. And some of these things may even relate. If something's suspect, you can actually even you can use this contextual evaluation to block access completely. If it's out of the ordinary. So utilizing the context, it doesn't need to be a straight up, if you are going to this app or you are logging in with this account, you always must do multi-factor, because that again is very disruptive.
That's a great point. And you definitely have those groups and users there. We did a great session recently on contextual authentication, and that it is a bit of a logic challenge, but worth it in the sense you can get to that granular segmentation so that you're doing the right authentication method for the right user experience. So great balancing of security and usability, or security and convenience, I guess, depending on what decade we're in.
Yep.
All right, great. So that's multi-factor authentication. Like we said, obvious and maybe beyond obvious choices you may not have thought of. And then another area we wanted to go into, of course, is biometrics and biometric authentication. Now, many of you, depends on how long you've looked at IAM solutions or have been aware of biometrics, may think, hey, maybe that's not just an obvious choice, maybe that's beyond obvious, but really it has become an obvious choice and is a fundamental foundational element to an IAM strategy, especially one that's going to weather the next even few years coming up. We see passwords fail over and over again, and biometrics are really starting to take over. There's a lot of predictions out there, even from folks like Gartner, that are saying, biometrics are going to start really being that standard approach. And it's a standard approach for things like multi-factor authentication, or sometimes called out-of-band authentication. And then, Greg, as you mentioned, the passwordless approaches have really just taken off. I know Microsoft just came out and said this year is the year of passwordless, right? And so that's really the next step in terms of the.
I thought it was last year. No.
Was it last year? I think it's every year.
They've been saying that for every year. Yeah, they've been doing it for a couple.
I know every year we have a session on getting rid of the password, and yet, most people out there are still using them. Some futuristic day, we won't even know the word password, but we'll have to see. And then really the reason being that we have to evolve. If our hackers are 1-2 steps ahead, evolving, and challenging us, we need to go further. And so, for example, in 2016, that's not even that recently, NIST came out and said, for example, like SMS or text-based one-time passwords have too many vulnerabilities and are not considered best in class for multi-factor authentication. And so, as you can see here, biometrics have amazing advantages. So faster, more convenient, more secure, and no need for that phone or that other device, which helps from someone looking for that device and trying to figure out, do I have it? And actually, it happened to me today. I had a one-time password sent to my phone, and it was in the other room. So I couldn't do what I was looking to do. Versus biometrics is always with you, right? It's convenient, it's fast. And on top of that, it's actually affordable in terms of what people think of. So Greg, you mentioned the multiple hardware tokens that are recommended by these vendors, or the SMS plan payments that are now being enforced. You look at that total cost of ownership compared to a biometrics, it's much lower with the biometrics. And so, Greg, obvious, here is passwords fail, biometrics are starting to take over. And so how about the beyond obvious when it comes to biometrics?
Sure, yeah, and it's actually on the SMS front, it's interesting because I think AT&T just introduced a new surcharge that, that messaging providers are passing on to their customers that I think it's basically a 50% increase over, what a per SMS cost is. So, it's definitely we're only going to see that more and more, so it's those per use costs add up, even if it's something that's less than a penny. When you've got thousands of users authenticating, multiple times per day, all that stuff adds up.
And I was
So,
going to put one more point too, is that
yeah.
I've heard a lot of times people go to implement MFA and tell the employee that they have to use their personal device. That does not fly. A lot of times, I've actually been worked somewhere where they said, you need to implement, we're going to use your phone, your personal phone, and if you enter the PIN wrong twice or 3 times, our security policy will wipe your phone. And I was like, well, then we're not going to be using my personal phone, right? So how do you also get around some of those things? So the challenges with MFA methods, biometrics have definitely started to take over. So, sorry, Greg, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that is interesting. When you use the phone, sometimes you need to have a lock on it, right? And so I, shudder, I don't actually have a lock on my phone. That means my kids can pick it up and use it, and they can impersonate me, which maybe that's what they can earn their allowance that way. But
There you go.
so, in regards to biometrics, all biometrics are not equal. So there are plenty of vendors that claim they have biometrics, but they are simply getting a binary thumbs up or thumbs down from something like an iPhone. So that type of device, it's got a closed biometric sensor. All right, so no vendors, like no third-party vendors can access like the biometric data or templates that are captured on that kind of a closed device. And so, that is great from a privacy perspective, but it's very limiting in a lot of other regards. Like, so that user has to only use that device. They can't perform biometric authentication from any other device, right? That is a per device authentication. They are unlocking, they're proving their identity to the phone in that case too. They are not proving their identity to your application directly. They're only using that to unlock their phone. So there's definitely, that kind of false front, if you will, of, hey, yeah, we have biometrics, but unless it is something like, so what BioKey does, where they have server-based biometrics. And so in this case, the template data is completely, captured, by these, open sensors, and it's rasterized, and, and they have patents, like, because again, I'm new to BioKey, and it was impressive to see everything that they've done over the years, all the different patents, they're basically industry leading, performance and, acceptance rates, and it's just really, really something. So they put a lot of effort into it, and it shows, because so all of that data is, basically encrypted at rest, encrypted in transit, full end-to-end protection. And so if an organization wants that control, then they can have it. And so in this case, it's also about being able to control the enrollment for those biometrics. For example, how many fingerprints need to be enrolled. But so they also have a mode that supports one-to-many matching, which is very interesting. We've seen this in at banks, for example, if tellers move around from station to station, and if there's a centralized server-based biometric, they can sit down at any machine and utilize a fingerprint sensor, let's say, and authenticate into Windows, right? So not just web apps, but in this case, logging into, for example, a desktop with biometrics and only having to use their fingerprint. They don't even need to give their username. And so that's that one-to-many option. That's something that they've worked on, for years. And so, very, very unique offering, in that regard. The second point, so remote access, we've already stressed that it's not going away. And so one of the cool things, again, that I learned, since coming on board is that centralized biometrics can function remotely. So, whether the user is authenticating locally or they're remoting in, like you said, to a VDI or using remote desktop, a local fingerprint reader can actually be utilized to authenticate to a remote workstation in this case. And so USB has something called virtual channel. And so this allows a local fingerprint reader to be seen by a remote workstation where the login is actually occurring. And that was pretty cool. So they've done that for years. And I think that's also like RDP, how you can actually, you can have sound, from the remote machine come back to your machine. I think it's the same approach, but it is something they have to build in. So, the remote access, and Kim, you just mentioned this, so passwords are something you know. Hardware tokens, phones, they're something you have, but biometrics are something you are. And so regardless of the modality, whether it's a fingerprint or a facial recognition or voice or a palm, if you need to be absolutely certain of an end user's identity, there is no substitute for biometrics. And it's also great that a user can't forget, their finger or their face or their voice. But so, all joking aside, it is possible there are people, for example, that don't have fingerprints. And so, and not just like professional cat burglars or anything like that, but just based on their line of work, what they've worked with, whether it's chemicals or even woodworkers, they just don't have fingerprints. And so, there are other ways, it's not just about biometrics necessarily, but having that flexibility to use different types and, be able to support those one-offs as well is super important. The last bullet on low cost, as we mentioned, those hardware tokens, vendors love to say, yeah, get a couple just in case. You don't want someone to be locked out. So, that adds to the cost. All of a sudden you're looking at double the cost of what you would expect. And so biometrics, there are multiple fingerprint readers that are supported out of the box. Maybe the built-in ones, we have professional ones as well. And so, there's also, even though we've kind of talked a little bit about phones, so we are coming out with a mobile app that can prevent the need for even having a physical fingerprint reader. And like I mentioned, being able to, whether it's palm or something of that nature, that's coming down the pike this year. Furthermore, and lastly, there is no cost per use, as there are with certain services like an SMS, like a mobile push, for example. Anytime you have a cost per use, those things are kind of unbounded, right? And so that's the other thing to just be aware of, is that if you've got a fingerprint reader, it doesn't cost you any more to swipe it once than it does, 100 times.
That's great. Yeah, and I think that's some of these things are misconceptions. Maybe we'll get to it in the, later on if we have extra time. But, a lot of these things, people thinking it's more expensive or, stealing my fingerprint and all of that. What you just went over in terms of the templating, the encryption, the data that's stored and everything else. A lot of these false kind of, perceptions of biometrics have really developed and evolved over time to really make it one of the most secure and convenient methods out there.
Yep.
And so
actually,
looking,
at that point, yeah. I'm sorry, I just wanted to, you just touched on something for me. So yeah, having a person like, worried about, what if my fingerprint gets stolen? And so it's an interesting parallel that just, having that, like, that data, it's like knowing someone's height or weight, right? So if you know someone's height or weight, it doesn't mean that you can impersonate that person. Right. So there are multiple things involved. Like, so for example, being able to try to get that data into the reader, right? So the end-to-end channel is fully encrypted, then a hacker would need to have to get that fingerprint data somehow into the physical reader. They have to hack that in order to even get that into the flow, right? So it is just very interesting. There's a lot of misconceptions. There's a lot of information, that's been propagated that isn't necessarily accurate. And so I had to throw that in there. But go ahead, Kim. You can.
No,
I'll get off my soapbox.
Demolition Man. If anybody's seen the movie, there's a whole eye scene. That's not how it works. It's not how it's done. So
now you're dating yourself. That's
I know. I need to get new references. References. All right, and then we're going to take it home with our last kind of category of obvious versus beyond obvious. We talked a lot about increasing security, kind of in the middle with the biometric side, but we definitely want to talk about the convenience side of things. And that really comes in with the other side of IAM, which is the single sign-on and self-service password reset. And these are really a must-have when it comes to fully building out that customer or that user experience and securing access to a system like PeopleSoft. SSO, obviously, right there is to reduce password prompts. So yes, the convenience of getting into one app, right, isn't really where that comes into play. But if you have multiple applications, which almost every single organization has, it's really all about reducing password prompts. The new average I just found actually is we're up to 100 passwords on average per person, up 25% in the last year. So every single application that someone has to access, if you're not able to single sign on to it or SSO to it, is going to prompt for a password or a login, and that just creates friction every time. On the self-service password reset side, it's a lot about reducing overhead and frustrations for the user, but we see most of the benefit because it's that forgot password link, that recover password, let's say, and we see customers able to reduce help desk calls related to password resets up to 95%. Plenty of studies out there showing the cost of every single password reset. Last I knew it was around, I think, $75 to $80. So if you start multiplying that by the number of users and number of forgotten passwords, it is very quickly going to increase your total cost of ownership. However,
and actually on that, in higher ed, we always see like the beginning of semesters, for example, is when everybody has forgotten their password, or new students, new employees have the same problem. How do you solve that kind of initial password setting? And so there's a lot of different options that we have, but that's just one example of that affects the user experience. It affects the help desk, and I don't think any help desk in higher ed looks forward to the beginning of semesters because of that.
No, for sure. And we had another customer doing it for customer access to a portal. This is in healthcare. And they were planning to hire another whole full-time employee in support just for the password resets that they were going to have until they implemented SSPR, and they could avoid it. So it is one of those things that we take for granted, I think, when we see that little forgot password link, but it is exponentially pays itself back in returns in terms of what kind of efficiencies and overhead it can get us. And so, Greg, in terms of PeopleSoft, however, it's a little harder to implement, right? That's one of the things we talk about quite a bit. And so talk through some of the options that the audience should know about when trying to get SSO, let's say, to the PeopleSoft application.
Yep. Yeah. So there's definitely like three big ones that we see. So one is rolling up your sleeves, doing custom development with the PeopleCode API. Good luck with that. Another one is using a reverse proxy approach and then setting HTTP headers. There's some similarity there, but in that case, that reverse proxy, maybe it's something you've already got in front of PeopleSoft, like an F5 or something. And then probably the most common and definitely the most straightforward is using something, a third party, like Appsian, for example. And so whether you're evaluating any of these or all of them, the big question is really like, how much time or money are you willing to spend on part of it, right? I mean, that's kind of really where it's going to come down to. If it's something that you're doing yourself, if you have the time to do that, you're going to save money, but you're, in the short term, but you are going to spend more time doing that, and then you're on the hook for supporting that custom work. So, when it comes to authentication, it's really, you got to be careful. You don't want to kind of overstep, if you can avoid it.
Okay, great. And then so looking at this, going into some of the more beyond obvious choices, right, in terms of what to look for if you're looking for a solution to actually get single sign-on to PeopleSoft. How about here, Greg? What some of the main things we can kind of see here in terms of what people should look for?
Yep. So, I mean, all those different features, like identity and access management is a big area, right? So it's not just single sign-on. There is the actual multi-factor is, at the forefront now for a lot of people. That password reset is still, a requirement for efficiency, and allowing people to work from home, whether it's user provisioning, all things like that. If you can find that single unified platform, to have all of that, that's when you're going to, that's your best bang for your buck, and so it does come back to the experience too. I mean, you can tell when it's different products doing different pieces, maybe you can tell when something's bolted on, and so also being able to support all different applications, whether it's cloud apps or on-premises web apps, or a desktop login or VPN authentication, like you mentioned. Maybe it's even SSO into thick client apps. All those, being able to find one place that does it and does it well is definitely helps you narrow down the field very quickly. That second bullet, so getting back to that experience, is how much control do you have over the user interface. That should be part of the evaluation process. And this can help prevent phishing. Like if you've got a generic log on that's easily reproducible, maybe it's one of the whether it's Microsoft or what have you, you're gonna be more likely, you're gonna to be target because it is straightforward to reproduce that, or it's a big pool of you're part of that larger pool of people that are affected by that. So keep that in mind. If you want full control over UI, something that PortalGuard gives, whether it's the logos and the images all the way down to field labels and error messages, it's all fully customizable. So don't compromise. Make it a seamless part of your brand, because it is the front door to all your applications. So it's not just like, oh yeah, I guess this is all we can do, so this is all that we will do. Sometimes it's not enough. Last one there is reduced total cost of ownership. And these, I kind of hinted about this, with the kind of SSO to PeopleSoft, is like who's responsible for support and maintenance, of that piece, and maybe of the entire IAM in general. Is the support and maintenance of the IAM product, is that part of your company's core competency? Is doing it yourself going to generate more revenue? So those are the questions to ask, and in this case, it's definitely better to rely on experts that you can lean on when you need to.
Yeah, that's I think the experience one, obviously being in marketing as well, making sure your brand stands out. And Greg, I think we have a few minutes left. Wanted to show just really at a high level again how it actually works. So when you're looking at an IAM or IDP provider and going SSO into PeopleSoft.
Yep, and I'm just going to follow the handy numbers here. So again, the end user in number one at the top, making that request to PeopleSoft. In this case, with Appsian in line, it is Appsian that sees the user is not authorized or they're not authenticated yet, and it pushes them down to PortalGuard, to the identity provider. So in this case, PortalGuard interacts with the end user directly to authenticate them. Again, this could be all kinds of things, whether it's biometrics or contextual/adaptive authentication, proving that user's identity, making sure that they are who they say they are, is done. And then the single sign-on piece, in this case, pushes in step number 3. The user gets a SAML response that gets sent over to the Appsian product. It will interpret that. It'll validate and verify that that SSO token is good, and then it will give the user a session with PeopleSoft. So that may not be the end of the story. There is one last one. So number 5 here is very important, because Appsian gives such granular access rules that if the user starts going off script and they start doing like non-standard things, they already have a session with PeopleSoft. And so the ability for Appsian to give you as an admin the ability to kind of add those rules and say, wait a second, they're going to some other more protected resource. They have the ability to call out to PortalGuard via our two-factor API, our backend two-factor API, and trigger another like a re-authentication. And so, this is great because starts kind of getting along the lines of where you want to be as an organization, with like continuous assessment, continuous authentication, being able to do that, and having it just work out of the boxes, puts that in its own class, really. So.
Yeah, that's key. And I think that, like you said, the granular access policies and things like that are being set up, especially with PeopleSoft or an application like that, that granularity is going to be essential. So, okay, so we're going to wrap up real quick. So overall, we wanted to give you some key takeaways in case you're just tuning back in. Hopefully you listened throughout the whole adventure that we just went on. But first and foremost, you want to make sure that you have your IAM strategy for PeopleSoft and actually for all your access and users and applications mapped out before looking at IAM solutions. We see so often that people just jump into kind of that obvious choice and are very quickly met with unexpected limitations and usually costs that go with it. Also, making sure you cover the basics, like we talked about, those obvious choices. So having multi-factor authentication, biometrics as part of your plan, single sign-on, and self-service password reset for convenience. And then, of course, look for a vendor who can partner with your business to modernize your IAM and go beyond the obvious options. That means either now or make sure that they can adapt and support you into the future. And so finally, if you are interested at all in multi-factor or self-service or seeing some of the options and the flexibility of an IDP such as PortalGuard, Identity as a Service, or IDaaS, you can sign up, try an account for yourself. We welcome everybody to do this. info.biokey.com/PortalGuard sandbox will get you to sign up for a free account. You can go in, you can try it, sign up, and test out multi-factor authentication yourself as well as self-service. You can always visit biokey.com to contact us, and we'd be more than happy to discuss your IAM strategy in the future. And with that, we will open it up to questions. So if you have questions, other than Richard saying he loves golf, thanks Richard. If anybody has any questions, this is the time. Please put them into the Q&A panel. I know we only have about a minute left. So Greg, looks like one came in terms of directory support. So what type of directories do you integrate with, and is Azure on the list?
Yeah, absolutely. So PortalGuard has supported things like Active Directory, like on-prem Active Directory, LDAP-based directories, and SQL-based directories for years, and we have just released support for Azure AD as a real-time directory, with our 6.5 version that's being released this month. So yeah, that's a timely question, and it's great because coupled with our IDaaS, you end up with a cloud-based IAM that has completely redundant infrastructure. And I'll be the first to say that if Azure AD ever goes down, then I'll probably I'll quit my job and become a potato farmer.
Well, you take me with you on that one. I think that's the case out there. And we've seen that too. So the directory support is key to go beyond just AD. I've heard a lot of times, especially for customer identity or identities that aren't employee-based, things like SQL support and other things are really key to have. We have one last question, and then I think we'll wrap it up. How do you select multi-factor authentication for students? Maybe another way to phrase that is, what's a good multi-factor authentication method for students?
Sure. Yep. Yeah. And so, I mean, there are 15 different types of that second factor that PortalGuard supports, so there's no shortage of options. Something that students typically not having access to as many, as secure or risky data as, let's say, an IT employee. We see pretty typically that a personal email address, sending an OTP to a personal email address, is generally deemed like good enough. It's also no cost to send out those SMS messages, so that's a factor to consider. Sending SMS messages, almost all, again, that's not a catch-all. That's not going to be a panacea, because there are going to be people who do not have cell phones. But that SMS is also still a very popular one. It's very well accepted, by end users. It's something that most people are familiar with at this point. So that's a popular one. And sometimes you can even allow people to bring their own token. So if the more technically inclined people may already have some of those tokens that we talked about, like a YubiKey or a FIDO token, you can actually set that up so that they can use their own as well. So yeah, that's a big topic, but there's just some of the options.
100%. Yeah, and I think that just goes to show the flexibility you need for a student versus maybe an internal employee versus a retiree trying to access their plans. Very important to know your users. For a retiree that doesn't have a cell phone, they can print out backup codes. That's right. We do print it. Another option. Yep. Something that I don't think everybody knows still is out there. But yeah, there are so many methods out there, and I think that's just one of the things you have to watch for, is make sure the options, whether obvious or beyond obvious, are there. All right, so I am. You liked it? You liked it? All right, so hopefully everybody, thank you so much for your time. I hope you enjoyed yourselves as much as Greg and I did on the discussion for IAM. I'll be on the Slack channel, security Slack channel, hanging out. If anybody has any questions afterwards or want to speak further, But thank you, Apsian, for the invite, and we look forward to connecting with all of you after the conference. Thanks so much.
All right. Well, thanks, Greg. Thanks, Kim. Appreciate the presentation. And if as Kim mentioned, if there are any questions related to how Apsian and BioKey work together to modernize PeopleSoft IAM, you can certainly reach out to them. You can certainly reach out to us. Either way, you'll get to the same place. So we would love to continue to have conversations with you further. So lastly, I would like to mention, we will be sending out a survey on Friday. We're in the process of planning our next summit. So if you could keep your eye out for that, it will be very helpful as we continue to plan our programming. I would certainly encourage you all to follow Apsian on LinkedIn and Twitter. We're pretty quick to announce our events and what we have going on those channels. So if you want to stay tuned, that would be a great place to do that. And as Kim mentioned, PSFTSummit does have an official Slack channel. It's new as of this particular summit. You can join by going to PSFTSummit.slack.com. It's super easy to sign up. And there's all kinds of cool conversations going on in there, even a couple job postings. So if you're interested in that, that's going on there too. So we have a couple more sessions here to round out the rest of the day. The next session is going to be the top 10 configuration security risks in a PeopleSoft environment, kind of continuing with the security theme. And if anybody has a accessibility project on the horizon, that's going to be the last presentation to finish us out. And that's achieving PeopleSoft accessibility, going beyond overlays and widgets. So I know that's a pretty popular conversation too right now. So we'll be back in about 15 or so minutes talking about PeopleSoft configuration risks. And until then, stick around. We'll be right back.